The day my cousin handed me a copy of the deed and smiled, I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just looked at him, folded the paper in half, and said, "Keep it." He thought he'd won. He had no idea that the most valuable piece of that property, the one thing that would unravel everything he'd built, had been in my name for 11 years, sitting quietly, waiting. This is the story of how a broken-down shed on a dirt road gave me back everything my grandfather ever meant for me to have. My grandfather's name was Earl, and if you'd met him, you would have understood immediately why people like him are becoming rare. He was the kind of man who woke up before the sun, not because an alarm told him to, but because the land needed him. He didn't talk much. He communicated in other ways. In the way he'd press a piece of fruit into your hand and say, "Try that." Or in the way he'd sit beside you at the end of a long day and just be there. Quiet, steady, like a fence post. He built that farm from almost nothing. I mean that literally. When he was 23 years old, he bought 42 acres of overgrown land with money he'd saved doing construction work in the city. His hands were so rough from those years that he used to joke they were more callous than skin. He planted everything himself, fenced it, dug irrigation channels by hand, raised cattle, kept chickens, grew a vegetable garden that my grandmother turned into the best meals I've ever eaten in my life. That farm was not just property. It was his autobiography. Every fence post, every pasture, every old oak tree at the edge of the southern field, it was a chapter of who he was. And we all knew it, the whole family. The problem is, knowing something and respecting it are two very different things. My cousin Daniel knew what that farm meant. He grew up on the same holidays I did, sitting at the same long wooden table, eating my grandmother's food, listening to Grandpa Earl tell the same stories about the early days. We were the same age, Daniel and I, born 8 months apart. We played in the same fields as kids. We rode the same old tractor until Grandpa finally said it was too dangerous. But somewhere along the way, Daniel started seeing that farm differently than I did. I saw a legacy. He saw an asset. When I was 24, I moved away. Not far, about 3 hours by car, but far enough that I couldn't be there every week. I'd taken a job in logistics, started building a life, sending money home when I could. My grandfather was getting older by then, and I helped however I was able, sometimes financially, sometimes coming back for weekends to help with repairs, fencing, whatever needed doing. Daniel, on the other hand, had moved back to the county, lived about 20 minutes from the farm, and in the beginning, I was grateful for that, genuinely, because it meant someone was close. Someone could check on Grandpa when the winters got hard, when a pipe burst, when the tractor needed a part that took 2 weeks to arrive. But proximity has a way of creating entitlement, slowly, quietly, like rust forming on metal you forgot to check. I started noticing it in small things first. Comments Daniel would make at family gatherings, little jokes about how he was basically running the place now. The way he'd talk over my grandfather when the conversation turned to the farm's future. The way he'd look at me sometimes with this expression I can only describe as territorial. I didn't say anything. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself family didn't work that way. I was wrong. My grandfather got sick when he was 79. Nothing sudden. A slow decline that happens to men who've spent decades working hard land and hard weather. His heart was tired. His knees were gone. He started spending more time in the house, then more time in the chair by the window, watching the fields he couldn't walk anymore. It was during one of my visits, a Tuesday in late October, I remember the light coming through the window sideways, that Grandpa Earl called me into the kitchen, closed the door, and told me he needed to tell me something. He slid a piece of paper across the table. "That shed on the north side," he said. "The one off the county road. I transferred it into your name 2 years ago. Quietly. Didn't tell anyone. I looked at the paper. It was a property transfer document. My name. The parcel number for the old storage shed and the half-acre it sat on, just outside the main farm boundary, accessed by a separate road. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. He looked out the window for a moment. Then he said, "Because I needed it to be safe. And anything I tell this family doesn't stay quiet for long." I didn't fully understand what he meant. Not yet. My grandfather passed away 14 months later. December. Cold, clear morning. I won't spend long on the grief. Anyone who's lost someone like that knows there are no words that do it justice. I'll just say that when we gathered for the reading of his will, I was still in that thick fog of loss where everything feels slightly unreal, like you're watching your life through foggy glass. The will had been updated. I found that out the moment the lawyer started reading. It had been updated 8 months before Grandpa died, at a time when his health had declined significantly and he was heavily reliant on Daniel for day-to-day help. The updated will left the entirety of the farm, all 42 acres, the house, the equipment, the cattle, to Daniel. The rest of us received small personal items: a watch, a quilt, a set of old tools. The room went very quiet. I looked at my mother. She had gone pale. My aunt, Daniel's mother, was staring at the floor. Daniel himself was sitting with his hands folded on the table, and he had a particular stillness about him that I recognized immediately. It wasn't shock. It wasn't grief. It was the stillness of a man who already knew exactly what was in that document. Afterward, when everyone else was still standing in the parking lot in stunned silence, Daniel found me. He handed me a copy of the deed, just like I described at the beginning of this story. And he smiled, and he said, "I know this is hard, but Grandpa wanted me to have it. He trusted me with it." And I said, "Keep it." Because I already knew what he didn't. I drove out to that shed 3 days after the funeral. I hadn't been there in years. It was a modest structure, maybe 30 feet long, tin roof, wood siding that had grayed with age. Grandpa had used it for overflow storage mostly. Old equipment, spare lumber. The kind of place that accumulates the physical memory of a working farm over decades. I unlocked the padlock with a key my grandfather had given me along with the transfer document, and I stood in the doorway for a long moment before I went inside. Because what I found in that shed wasn't just old tractor parts and spare fencing. Along the back wall, behind a wooden cabinet, was a metal lockbox. Inside the lockbox were documents, organized carefully. In my grandfather's handwriting, labeled with dates. There were letters. Written to me, to my mother, to my aunt. Letters that Grandpa Earl had written over the last 3 years of his life, describing what he called my real intentions. He wrote about the farm, about how he'd wanted to divide it equally, about conversations he'd had with Daniel that had begun to concern him, conversations where Daniel had pushed repeatedly for sole ownership, about a visit from a lawyer that Daniel had arranged, a lawyer my grandfather had not chosen himself, during a week when the rest of the family was away. There was a handwritten note dated 2 months before the will was changed. It said, "I am not in a sound state to make these decisions. I am being pressured. If anything happens to me and the will reads differently than what I've told my family, know that it was not made freely." He had signed it, had it notarized, had stored it here, in the one piece of property he'd quietly placed beyond Daniel's reach. My grandfather had known. He'd seen what was coming, and he had built a small, quiet fortress around the truth. I sat down on an old wooden crate, and I stayed there for a long time. I contacted an attorney the following week. a probate and estate litigation specialist, someone who understood exactly what we were dealing with. When I showed her the contents of that lockbox, she went quiet in a way that told me everything I needed to know. She read my grandfather's note twice. She held up the notarization. She set it down carefully and said, "This is strong." The legal term for what Daniel had done, or what the evidence strongly suggested, is called undue influence. It means that a person in a position of power over a vulnerable individual uses that power to alter their estate documents in a way that doesn't reflect the person's true wishes. It's notoriously difficult to prove. But a signed, notarized statement from the testator himself, made while he still had capacity, describing the pressure he was under, that is not nothing. That is significant. We filed a will contest. Daniel's response was immediate and aggressive. He hired his own attorney. He claimed my grandfather had been of sound mind and full intention. He claimed the letters were fabricated until the handwriting analysis confirmed they were authentic. He claimed the notarized note was taken out of context, which is difficult to argue when the context is written in the same document. The process took 14 months. I won't pretend it was easy. It was exhausting in a way that went beyond legal fees and depositions. It was emotionally brutal. Because you're not just fighting a legal case, you're fighting over the memory of someone you loved, watching it get picked apart in conference rooms and courtroom filings, watching a family fracture along fault lines you always knew were there, but hoped would never fully crack open. My aunt stopped speaking to me 6 months into the process. Daniel spread stories through the extended family that I was greedy, that I was doing this for the money, that I was betraying my grandfather's memory by dragging his name through court. Some people believed him. People who weren't there. People who didn't read the letters. People who found it easier to choose a side than to sit with the uncomfortable truth. But I kept going. Because it wasn't about money. It was about the fact that my grandfather had tried to protect something, his legacy, his wishes, his farm, and had hidden that protection in a shed with my name on it because he trusted me to find it and use it. I wasn't going to let that trust die in a filing cabinet. The judge ruled in our favor. Not completely. The legal system rarely gives you everything, but the core of it held. The will was found to have been executed under conditions that raised sufficient concern about undue influence. The estate was ordered to be redistributed according to an earlier version of the will, one that divided the farm equally among my grandfather's surviving children and their heirs. Daniel retained a portion. He didn't lose everything, but he lost the majority of what he'd taken, and he lost the house, the heart of the property. He didn't speak to me on the day of the ruling. He walked out of the courthouse without looking back, and I stood on the steps in the cold afternoon air and felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not triumph, not relief exactly. Something quieter, something that felt more like completion. Like a sentence that had been left unfinished for years had finally reached its period. I go back to the farm more often now. My portion of it includes the southern pasture and the old oak trees at the edge of the field, the ones my grandfather planted when he was young. Last spring, I brought my daughter there for the first time. She's 6. She ran across the pasture with her arms out like she was trying to catch the wind, and I stood at the fence and watched her, and I thought about my grandfather, about the man who got up before the sun, about the hands more callous than skin, about the way he communicated in fruit pressed into palms and silence beside you at the end of a long day. The shed is still there, on its half-acre, off the county road. I've cleaned it out now, repaired the roof, put in a workbench along the back wall, the same wall where the lockbox used to sit. Sometimes I go there just to be quiet, just to sit in the place where my grandfather hid his truth and trusted it to me. He knew what he was doing when he put that shed in my name. He knew long before I did what the future held. And he built a small, careful fortress around the things that mattered. His real wishes, his real legacy, the relationship between a grandfather and a grandchild that no updated will could ever erase. People ask me sometimes if I hate Daniel. I don't. That took a long time to get to, but I got there. Because hatred is a thing that lives in you, and I don't want to spend the rest of my life giving him that space. What I feel is something closer to sadness. Sadness that someone who grew up at the same table, who heard the same stories, who ate the same food and played in the same fields, looked at all of that and saw something to take rather than something to share. My grandfather built that farm with the idea that it would outlast him, that it would mean something to the people he loved, that it would be a place where his family could gather and remember him and carry something of him forward. It still is, just differently than any of us planned. The land is divided now. The family is quieter, smaller, more honest about its fault lines, but the oak trees are still there. The pasture still catches the morning light the way it always has. And my daughter still runs across it with her arms out, trying to catch the wind. Some things survive, the ones that are built right, the ones that are built to last. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever been through something like this, or if you love someone who has, leave a comment below. Tell me your story, and if you're new here, hit subscribe. Because there are more stories like this one, and they all start the same way, with someone who thought they had won, and a small, quiet thing they forgot to check.